The last student of the day finally shuffled out, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that was, to Elena Volkov, deeply satisfying. Silence. Well, almost. The faint, metallic scent of the rain outside mixed with the old wood smell of the practice room. She sat perfectly still on the piano bench, her spine a straight line against the fall of her charcoal gray blazer. Her fingers, resting on her knees, were long and pale, unadorned except for the memory of 1,000 scales. The piece the boy had been butchering was still a ghost in the air, Chopin's Prelude in E minor. It was meant to sound like a sigh, like heartache. He had made it sound like a complaint. She closed her eyes, letting the correct version play in her mind, each note a perfect, gleaming pearl. Her own teacher, a fearsome man from Moscow, had drilled that sound into her. Precision first, he would bark. Then, maybe, you earn the right to feel something. A soft squeak broke her concentration. The door at the far end of the room, which led to the storage closet, swung inward. It was the janitor. Elena didn't know her name. She was just part of the building's background noise, like the hum of the old radiator or the distant traffic from the street. The woman was small, wrapped in a drab, navy blue uniform that seemed to swallow her. Her hair, a mix of gray and faded brown, was pulled into a messy knot. She carried a large plastic bucket, and a mopped-out Elena gave a small internal sigh. An intrusion. She watched, her expression neutral, as the woman set down her bucket with a gentle thud and began her work. She moved quietly, almost apologetically, her rubber-soled shoes whispering on the linoleum. She wiped down the windowsill where the rain had spat against the glass, then moved to the empty music stands, polishing their metal with a soft cloth. Elena's gaze drifted to the piano. The Steinway Grand was the only thing of true value in this shabby room. Its black lacquer was a deep, perfect void, reflecting the dim ceiling lights. But on its surface, she could see the smudges. The boy's nervous, sweaty fingerprints marred the fallboard. A faint haze of dust and skin oil dulled the elegance of the ebony keys. The janitor finished with the stands and approached the piano. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at it. Not cleaning, just looking. Her hands, red and rough from work, hung at her sides. Then, slowly, she pulled a fresh cloth from her apron pocket. She leaned over and began to wipe the polished wood, her movements careful, almost reverent. She circled each smudge until it vanished. Elena felt a prick of something not annoyance, exactly, but a sharp sense of order. The woman was doing her job, but it wasn't enough. The instrument's purity wasn't just about its surface. The keys, Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and sharp in the quiet room, like the crack of a single note. The janitor flinched, stopping mid-motion. She turned her head, her eyes meeting Elena's for the first time. They were a pale, watery blue, set in a network of fine lines. They need attention. Elena continued, nodding toward the piano. Fingerprints. Oils from the skin. They obscure the clarity for the next student. She didn't smile. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. The janitor blinked and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She turned back to the piano, but instead of just wiping the keys, she did something strange. She placed her cloth down. With her bare right hand, she gently pressed down on middle C. It made no sound. She had engaged the mute pedal with her knee. She pressed a few more keys in silence, her head tilted, as if listening to something only she could hear. Elena's eyebrows drew together. This was beyond cleaning. This was dabbling. "Excuse me," Elena said, her tone frosting over. "What are you doing?" The woman snatched her hand back, as if the key had burned her. She picked up the cloth again. It sticks sometimes," she murmured, her voice low and husky, with an accent Elena couldn't quite place. The F sharp above middle C. It is slow to come back up. I was just checking. Elena stood up. She walked over to the piano, her heels clicking decisively. She stood beside the janitor, close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of soap and bleach on her uniform. Elena played the F sharp. It was a little sluggish. The maintenance technician handles the action, Elena stated, as if explaining something to a child. It is a complex mechanism. Not for. She let the sentence hang, her eyes sweeping over the woman's bucket and mop. The important thing is that the playing surface is clean. Just stick to what you know, please. Wipe the keys and move on. The words hung in the air, colder than she had intended. The janitor's shoulders rounded slightly, as if trying to make herself even smaller. She didn't look at Elena again. She just picked up her cloth and began meticulously polishing each ivory and ebony key, starting at the bottom and working her way up with a rhythm that was slow and thorough. She paid special attention to the gaps between the keys, where dust loved to hide. Elena watched for a moment, then turned and gathered her leather portfolio of music. The critique was delivered. Order was being restored. She felt a familiar, tight sense of control. As she headed for the door, her mind was already moving to the next task, reviewing the recordings of today's lessons, planning tomorrow's exercises. She paused at the doorway and looked back. The janitor was still polishing, her back to the room. Her entire world shrunk down to the 78 squares of wood and ivory under her cloth. The woman was a fixture, part of the room's maintenance. Necessary, but irrelevant to the art that happened here. Elena left, the heavy practice room door closing with a solid final thud behind her. Inside, the only sounds were the soft rhythmic whisper of cloth on wood and the distant drumming of the rain. The janitor finished the last key. She stood there for a long moment, her rough, red hand hovering just above the glossy surface. Then, with a sigh so quiet it was lost in the empty room, she picked up her bucket and mop, turned off the main light, and slipped back into the darkness of the storage closet, leaving the perfect, silent piano gleaming in the glow of the exit sign. The following week, the conservatory was caught in the grip of a tight, nervous energy. The annual Chopin competition was just a month away, and Elena had staked her reputation on one student, a young man with brilliant technique and a frustratingly cool heart. His name was Leo, and he could play the notes of the ballade in G minor with stunning accuracy. But it sounded like a beautifully engineered machine, not a story. Elena began keeping late hours, the practice room becoming her war room. She and Leo would dissect passages, measure silences, and fight over phrasing until both of them were tense and exhausted. He would leave, shoulders hunched, and Elena would remain, sitting in the deepening twilight, her own frustration a sour taste in her mouth. It was during these lonely evenings that she first noticed the small, strange perfection stop one morning, after a particularly grueling session the night before, where the piano's action had felt a little heavy. She arrived to find the touch miraculously lighter, more responsive. She assumed the technician had made a late visit. Another day, the faint, tinny buzz that had plagued the upper register for weeks was simply gone. The sound was pure and clear. She made a mental note to thank the technician for his discretion. Then there was the matter of the bench. Elena was very particular about its height. She kept a small folded note card under one leg to stop a faint wobble. One Thursday, she came in and found the wobble was gone. The note card was still there, but it seemed unnecessary. She removed it, sat, and the bench was perfectly, solidly level. It was odd, but she dismissed it. Perhaps the floor had settled. The final, and most puzzling, change was in the room itself. Elena was a creature of orderly habit. She would leave her scores stacked neatly on a side table, her pencil placed precisely on top. One night, in her fatigue, she had left the room a mess, the score for the ballade splayed open on the piano, a water glass on the floor beside the bench, her sweater draped over a chair. The next morning, everything was in order. But not her order. The score was closed and placed on the side table, yes. But it wasn't centered. It was angled slightly, as if someone had been reading it and set it down casually. Her pencil was not on top, but beside it, the eraser end pointing towards the piano. The sweater was not draped, but folded neatly over the back of the chair. The water glass was gone, likely taken to be washed. It felt intimate. It felt like an intrusion. A cold thread of irritation wound through Elena. Was the cleaning staff being presumptuous? She thought of the janitor, the one with the rough hands and the quiet manner. Was she going beyond her duties? That Friday, Leo's practice was a disaster. He was tired, playing from memory, and he kept stumbling in the same furious crescendo. After the fourth broken attempt, Elena snapped. "Stop. Just stop," she said, her voice tight. "You are thinking about your fingers, not the storm in the music. It is not a series of notes. It is a catastrophe. You must feel it coming." Leo stared at the keys, his jaw clenched. "I know what the notes are. That is the problem." Elena stood up, pacing the small space behind him. "You know them in here." She tapped her own temple. "But not in here." She pressed a hand to her chest. "You play like you are observing the storm from a very clean, very dry window. You need to be in the rain." It was useless. She could see the wall go up behind his eyes. After another half-hour of diminishing returns, she dismissed him. He left quickly, relief evident in his retreating back. The silence he left behind was thick and heavy. Elena sank onto the now perfectly stable bench. A profound weariness washed over her, deeper than tiredness. It was the fear that she was wrong, that her entire life's philosophy, precision first, control above all, was producing technically flawless musicians who had nothing to say. The ghost of her old teacher's voice sneered in her memory. Asterisk sentiment is for the audience. Your job is to execute. Asterisk. She needed air. She needed to be away from the piano that seemed to mock her. She gathered her things, turned off the light, and strode out into the dimly lit hallway, heading for the exit. The cold night air hit her face, a shock that cleared her head. She walked for a block, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. And then she remembered. Her master notebook, the one with all her annotations for Leo's ballade, was still on the side table in the practice room. She couldn't leave it. With a groan of frustration, she turned and marched back. The main doors were still unlocked for the evening faculty. The grand hallway of the conservatory was dark, lit only by the emergency lights, making the marble floors look like still black water. Her practice room was at the far end. As she approached, she heard it. Music. It was muffled, coming from behind the closed door of the main recital hall, a room 10 times the size of her practice space. It wasn't a student practicing. This was no halting run-through of scales or fractured sonata. This was a deep, rolling, powerful sound. It was piano music, but unlike any she had heard in this building for a long, long time. She froze, her hand inches from the handle of her own room's door. The piece was unfamiliar, a swirling, dark torrent of notes, full of a bottomless sorrow and a wild, angry beauty. The technique was flawless, but that wasn't what gripped her. It was the feeling. It was as if the piano itself was weeping and roaring at the same time. This was the storm she had tried and failed to explain to Leo. This was being in the rain. Her teacher's voice hissed. Asterisk, do not listen. It is unprofessional. Asterisk, but her feet moved on their own, carrying her silently to the heavy double doors of the recital hall. One was slightly ajar. She peered through the narrow crack. The vast hall was in darkness, save for a single lonely spotlight over the concert grand on the stage. And there, at the keyboard, was the janitor. The woman was transformed. The drab blue uniform was still there, but she wore it like a forgotten robe. Her shoulders were no longer hunched. They were powerful, driving. Her head was thrown back slightly, her eyes closed, her face a mask of naked, unguarded emotion, pain, longing, a fierce and terrible joy. Her rough, red hands flew over the keys, not with Alana's surgical precision, but with the authority of a general commanding an army. The music poured out of her, out of the piano, filling the empty hall with a living, breathing tragedy. Elena felt the breath leave her body. She felt dizzy. The world tilted on its axis. This was impossible. This cleaner of floors, this polisher of keys. This was a master. A true, undisputed master. The raw, emotional power of the playing was a physical force, shaking something loose inside Elena's own tightly controlled chest. She watched, paralyzed, as the music built to a shattering climax and then fell away into a final, resonant chord that hung in the air like smoke. The janitor's hands came to rest in her lap. She sat there for a long moment, head bowed, shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths. Then, as if feeling the weight of the gaze upon her, the woman's head turned slowly. Her pale blue eyes looked not at Elena, but directly at the crack in the door, as if she had known she was there the entire time. Elena stumbled back. A hot rush of shame, confusion, and utter panic flooded her. She turned and fled down the dark hallway, her footsteps echoing like gunshots, not stopping until she was out in the cold, anonymous night, her heart hammering against her ribs, the glorious, terrible music still screaming in her ears. The walk home was a blur of cold air and sharper, colder thoughts. Elena moved through the darkened streets, but she wasn't really there. She was still in the recital hall, watching those work-worn hands command the keyboard. The image was burned onto the back of her eyes. The sound, that devastating cascade of feeling, was a loop she couldn't stop. She felt a confusing tumble of emotions. First, and most bitter, was a hot spike of betrayal. That piano, the concert grand, was the heart of the conservatory. It was for artists, for prepared performances, not for secret, midnight play acting by the cleaning staff. It was a violation of the instrument's dignity. It was a violation of the natural order of things. Underneath that anger, cold and slippery, was shame. The memory of her own words echoed, now sounding stupid and small in her head. Just stick to what you know. She had said that to a woman who could make a piano, speak with a voice she herself had never found. The shame made the anger burn hotter dot by the time she let herself into her quiet, perfectly ordered apartment. A hard, clear purpose had pushed aside the confusion. This could not stand. It was irregular. It was deceptive. The head of the piano faculty, a man who dozed through committee meetings and loved rules above all else, would have to be told. The janitor's little secret would be ended. She slept poorly, the music twisting through her dreams. The next morning, she dressed with extra care, her armor of a tailored dress and sharp blazer. She arrived at the conservatory early, her footsteps deliberate on the polished floors. She did not go to her practice room. She went straight to the administrative wing, to the office of the head of the school. An elderly man who had been there since the building's stones were laid. He was at his desk, peering through old-fashioned glasses at a budget report. He looked up, his face a friendly map of wrinkles. "Elena, to what do I owe this honor so early?" She sat down without being asked, her back straight. "There is a matter of security and of propriety." He put down his pen, giving her his full attention. "Oh? Last night? Very late. I returned for a notebook, and I heard music from the recital hall. I investigated. She leaned forward slightly. It was the janitor, the older woman in the blue uniform. She was playing the concert grand. She paused, waiting for his shock, his outrage. He merely blinked slowly behind his glasses. I see, he said, his voice calm. It is completely unacceptable. Elena pressed on, her tone crisp. The instrument is priceless. Its regulation is delicate. To have an unauthorized person, someone without any background, treating it as a toy for after-hours amusement is a serious risk. Not to mention the security breach. How does she even have access? The old man took off his glasses and began to clean them slowly with a handkerchief. He didn't look at her. She has a key, he said simply. Well, she shouldn't. Elena's composure cracked, just for a second. She is there to clean, not to perform. The arrogance of it is astounding. I have had to speak to her before about overstepping. She was fiddling with the action of a practice room piano, pretending to know something about it. She needs to be reminded of her place. Frankly, she should be disciplined. The headmaster put his glasses back on. He looked at her then, and his gaze was different. The usual sleepy kindness was gone, replaced by something sad and very clear. Her place, he repeated softly. He let the words sit in the air between them for a long moment. Elena, do you know her name? Elena waved a hand, impatient. I don't need to know her name to know the rules. Her name, he said, his voice now firm, is Marta Veshnyakova. The name meant nothing to Elena. She shook her head, a dismissive gesture. That is irrelevant, is it? The old man sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked. When you were a girl, practicing your scales, did you ever hear of the Veshnyakova recordings? From Leningrad. Before the wall fell, a tiny, distant bell rang in the deepest part of Elena's memory. A name mentioned by her old, fierce teacher, spoken once in a tone of rare, grudging respect. A ghost from the past. She was a pianist? The question felt stupid as she asked it. She is a pianist, the headmaster corrected gently. One of the most gifted of her generation. They said she had thunder in her left hand and weeping in her right. She was set to tour the world. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Then life happened. A great personal loss. The kind that breaks more than your heart. It broke her will to be in the light. She left everything. Came to this country many years ago, a shadow of herself. She had only one request, to be near pianos. Not to teach, not to perform, just to be near them. He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the school. We gave her a job, a key, a sanctuary. She keeps to herself. She listens sometimes from the hallways. And on rare nights, when the building is empty and the weight of the silence is too much, she plays. For herself. For no one else. The office was suddenly very quiet. The hum of the computer, the tick of the clock on the wall, felt terribly loud. Elena's carefully built argument about security, about propriety, about the arrogance of a cleaner crumbled to dust, leaving nothing but a hollow, howling emptiness inside her. The practice rooms, she whispered, her voice dry. The sticky key. The buzz, the bench. A small, sad smile touched the old man's lips. She has been maintaining the instruments in this building for 20 years. The technician consults her on the voicing of the concert grand. That amusement you heard. That is likely the only time the old girl gets to sing the way she was meant to. Elena could not speak. She felt herself shrinking in the chair, becoming very small. She saw not a presumptuous janitor, but a woman carrying a universe of sorrow, finding solace in the one language she had left. And she, Elena, had told her to stick to cleaning. I I didn't know, she finally managed, but the words were ashes. Of course you didn't, the headmaster said, not unkindly. She didn't want you to. She doesn't want anyone to. The question, Elena, is what will you do now that you do? He picked up his pen again, a soft signal that the conversation was over. Elena stood up. Her legs felt unsteady. She walked out of the office, down the polished hallway, but she didn't see any of it. She saw only the janitor's Marta's face in the spotlight, eyes closed, transformed by a beauty that Elena had spent her whole life chasing, only to scold its bearer for dusting improperly. She did not go to her practice room. She couldn't face the piano. She left the building and walked, directionless, the old man's final question ringing louder than any music in her ears. Asterisk, what will you do now that you do? She had no answer. The world, her perfectly ordered world where talent was announced with certificates and polish, had just cracked right down the middle. The days that followed felt thin and brittle, like ice over a deep, dark pond. Elena went through the motions. She taught her students, she corrected fingerings, she marked scores with her sharp, precise pencil. But her mind was elsewhere. The music from the hall played in her head at odd moments in the middle of a lesson, while making tea in the silence just before sleep. It wasn't just the notes. It was the feeling behind them, that raw, unchecked torrent she had spent a lifetime building walls against. Her practice sessions with Leo became strained. She would listen to his technically flawless runs and hear only emptiness. The storm she demanded of him now felt like a childish game. She had heard a real storm, and it had shaken her foundations. One afternoon, as Leo practiced a particularly dry passage, Elena's eyes drifted to the window. It overlooked a small enclosed courtyard used for storing empty instrument cases and broken stands. And there, sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench, was Marta. She wasn't cleaning. She was just sitting, her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. A single forgotten autumn leaf skittered past her feet. She looked small again, wrapped in her blue uniform. The immense woman from the piano completely vanished. The dynamics here are still flat. Elena heard herself say to Leo, her voice automatic, "Play it again." From the top, Leo sighed, a frustrated huff of air, and began again. The notes were correct. They were always correct. And they meant nothing. After he left, Elena didn't move. She stayed at the piano, her fingers resting on the cool ivory of middle C. She thought of Marta's hands on this very keyboard, not playing, but polishing, caring for it. She thought of her own hands, which only ever demanded from the instrument perfection, clarity, obedience. A strange, hollow feeling opened up in her chest. She stood and walked to the window. Marta was still on the bench. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, Elena left the room. She walked down the back staircase, pushed open the heavy fire door, and stepped into the courtyard. The air was colder outside, biting. Marta didn't look up as Elena approached. The sound of her heels on the concrete seemed terribly loud now Elena stopped a few feet away. She didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt too big, too sudden. "I didn't know," felt like the weak excuse it was. "The F sharp," Elena said finally, her voice awkward in the quiet. "The sticky one. It's perfect now." Marta looked up slowly. Her pale eyes were calm, but there was a deep weariness in them, the kind that comes from carrying a heavy weight for a very long time. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I spoke to the headmaster," Elena continued, the words stumbling out. "He told me who you are, who you were." A faint, sad smile touched Marta's lips. "I am the janitor," she said, her accent softening the words. "That is who I am." "No," Elena said, and the force in her own voice surprised her. "No, you're not." She took a step closer. I heard you. In the hall. What you played, it was? She trailed off. She had a vocabulary of 1,000 technical terms. Rubato, sforzando, con brio. None of them fit. They were small, neat boxes for something that had been vast and wild. It was the truth. She finished lamely. Marta studied her for a long month. The scrutiny made Elena want to fidget, to straighten her blazer. She felt like a student who hadn't practiced. You are the teacher, Marta said. The one who wants everything clean? There was no malice in it, just a simple statement. I thought I knew what that meant, Elena replied, looking down at her own clean, manicured hands. Clean technique. Clean execution. I thought feeling was messy. A distraction. Marta was silent. A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city. How? The question burst out of Elena, honest and desperate. How do you do it? How do you get that sound? My student, he has all the skill, but he plays like a ghost. You play like... She shook her head, unable to finish. Marta looked away, her gaze going to the high walls of the courtyard. You asked the wrong question, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You ask, how like it is a trick, a fingering. It is not a how. She turned her hands over, palms up in her lap. They were red, chapped, marked with old scars and recent nicks. You must have something to say. And music is just the voice for it. My teacher, a long time ago, he said to me, you can play all the notes and say nothing. Or you can play one note and say everything. It depends on what is inside you, waiting to be said. Elena stared at those hands. They were the hands of a laborer. They were also the hands that had conjured a universe of sound. She thought of her own student, Leo, and his cool, perfect touch. She thought of herself playing for judges and critics, for approval and medals. What had she ever needed to say? What if... Elena's voice was thick. What if you don't have anything to say? Marta's eyes met hers again. For the first time, there was a flicker of something there, not pity, but a kind of recognition. Then you are lucky, she said softly. And you are poor. The music comes from the cracks, from the broken places, from what you lose. She looked down at her own hands, closing them slowly into fists, then releasing them. It is a costly voice. The truth of it landed heavily on Elena. Her whole life had been about building a flawless self, brick by brick. No cracks, no broken places. She had polished her talent to a high shine, but she had built it over a hollow center. She had been playing from a place of perfect emptiness. I told you to stick to cleaning, Elena said. The shame flooding back, hot and acute. Marta actually let out a small sound. Almost a laugh, but without any humor. It was good advice. Cleaning is simple. It is honest. You see a dirt, you wipe it away. Music, she shook her head. Music is not so simple. It does not clean. It stains. She stood up then, her movements stiff. The moment was over. She was the janitor again, the invisible woman. The recital is soon, Marta said, not looking at Elena. For your student. I will make sure the piano in the small hall is perfect. It was a dismissal and a kindness. Elena could only nod, words failing her completely. She watched as Marta walked to a small storage shed, took out a push broom, and began with slow, methodical strokes to sweep the forgotten leaves from the courtyard. The whisper of the bristles on concrete was the only sound. Elena went back inside, up to her silent practice room. She sat at the piano, but didn't play. She just sat in the quiet, feeling the unfamiliar, unsettling ache of the cracks beginning to form in the perfect, polished surface of everything she thought she knew. The question wasn't how to get Leo to play with feeling. The question, the terrifying question, was what she herself had to say. And for the first time in her life, she was afraid she might have nothing at all. The night of the annual benefactors' recital arrived, draped in a forced, glittering tension. The small concert hall was full. Men in dark suits and women in shimmering dresses sat in rows, their polite chatter filling the space with a low hum. The air smelled of perfume, floor polish, and expectation. Elena sat in the third row, a fixed, pleasant smile on her face. It felt like a mask made of thin glass. To her left was Leo, his back rigid, his fingers nervously tapping a silent arpeggio on his knee. His performance was the centerpiece of the evening. To her right were important donors, people who wrote checks that kept the old building standing. The headmaster gave a short, warm speech about the future of music. Elena didn't hear a word. Her eyes were fixed on the stage, on the beautiful, silent grand piano. She thought of the hands that had secretly cared for it, that knew its soul better than anyone. Hands that should have been the ones performing tonight, receiving this applause, not hiding in the shadows. Then it was Leo's turn. He walked onto the stage, his steps careful, and gave a stiff bow. He sat. He adjusted the bench. He took a deep, visible breath. Then he began the Chopin ballade, and he played it perfectly. Every note was in its place. Every crescendo was observed, every tempo shift executed with accuracy. It was a masterclass in technical control. Elena watched the faces of the audience. They were attentive, appreciative. They nodded at the difficult passages. It was exactly the kind of performance she had spent years training her students to deliver. But as the music flowed, flawless and cold, Elena felt a deep, aching sadness. It was like watching a beautifully painted portrait of a person, instead of the living, breathing person themselves. There was no storm. There was no risk. There was only a perfect, empty shell. She saw now, with painful clarity, that this was her legacy. Not musicians, but technicians. Not artists who spoke, but skilled mimics. The final chords rang out, precise and clean. The audience applauded. It was solid, respectful applause. Leo stood, bowed again, relief washing over his face. He had done what was asked of him. He walked off the stage to more polite clapping. The headmaster returned to the podium as the applause died down. The evening, it seemed, was over. People began to gather their wraps, to lean towards each other and murmur polite reviews. But the old man did not get his closing thanks. Instead, he held up a hand, a strange, solemn look on his face. The room quieted, curious. "We are, of course, dedicated to the future," he began, his voice softer than before. "But music is not only about the future. It is a chain linking us to the past, to voices that, for many reasons, fell silent before the world could hear all they had to say." Elena's heart gave a single, hard thump. She sat up straight, her glass mask of a smile gone. "Tonight, we are granted a rare privilege," the headmaster continued. He looked not at the audience, but toward the side of the stage, into the shadows of the wing. "To hear one of those voices, not as a memory on a scratchy recording, but here, in this room, alive." He didn't announce a name. He simply extended his hand, a gesture of both invitation and deep respect. For a long moment, nothing happened. The audience was utterly still, confused. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped into the light. It was Marta. She was not in her uniform. She wore a simple, dark dress, plain and without ornament. Her hair was still in its practical knot. She walked to the piano slowly, her head slightly bowed, not looking at the sea of faces. She looked only at the instrument. A soft, puzzled whisper rippled through the crowd. Elena saw a woman in front of her lean to her husband and whisper, "Isn't that the cleaning woman?" Marta reached the piano. She did not bow. She simply stood beside the bench for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood, as if greeting an old friend. Then she sat. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was a different silence than before Leo played. This was thick, heavy with anticipation and a faint, collective bewilderment. Marta placed her hands in her lap. She closed her eyes. She took a breath that seemed to draw the air from the entire room. And then she began. It was not Chopin. It was the same piece Elena had heard that night in the dark, the tumultuous, sorrowful, soaring music. But now, in the full light, with a room full of people, it was transformed. It was not a secret anymore. It was a confession. Those rough, red hands became vessels of pure power and tenderness. The music that poured forth was not just notes. It was a story. You could hear the joy in it, bright and fleeting like sun on broken glass. You could hear the immense, crushing loss, a bottomless grief that shook the very walls. You could hear anger, sharp and defiant, and beneath it all, a love for the music itself, so profound it was almost painful to witness. Elena stopped breathing. She watched, utterly transfixed. This was not playing. This was being. Marta was not performing for them. She was simply opening a door to a room inside her soul, and the music was what lived there. The cracks she spoke of weren't flaws. They were the very channels through which this beauty flooded into the world. Tears, hot and completely unexpected, welled in Elena's eyes. She did not wipe them away. She looked around the hall. Every face was turned upward, captured. The woman who had whispered about the cleaning woman was crying openly. A stern-looking businessman had his hand over his mouth, his eyes wide. Leo, standing in the wing, stared as if seeing music for the very first time. The piece built, higher and higher, a colossal wave of sound that seemed it would break the piano, break the room. And then, with a heart-stopping shift, it fell away into a passage of such quiet, tender sadness that it felt like a whispered lullaby for every lost thing in the world. The final notes were not loud, but they were immense, ringing in the silence that followed, a silence that was alive and vibrating. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. No one clapped then. As one, the audience rose. The sound was not polite applause. It was a roar, a thunderous, tear-streaked, standing ovation. It was a wave of raw emotion given back to the woman at the piano. Marta opened her eyes. She looked out at the sea of standing people, the noise washing over her. For a brief second she looked lost, like a creature brought suddenly into the light. Then a slow, deep change came over her face. It was not a smile of triumph. It was something quieter, more profound in acceptance. A gentle, weary acknowledgement of the gift she had just given, and the receipt of something back. She simply nodded once, a small private gesture, and placed her hand back on the piano, steadying herself. Elena clapped until her hand stung, the tears now streaming freely down her face. She was not clapping for a performance. She was applauding the shattering of her own world. Every rule, every judgment, every cold, precise standard she had lived by lay in pieces at her feet. She had been so busy polishing the surface of things. She had missed the music that lived in the depths. As the ovation finally began to subside and Marta quietly left the stage. Not to return, Elena looked down at her own hands, resting now in her lap. They were smooth, skilled, and empty. But for the first time, she felt a strange, aching possibility in them. The silence inside her was no longer just empty. It was waiting. It was a clean slate, a freshly wiped key, ready not for a perfect, practiced scale, but for its own first, true, imperfect note. She did not know what that note would be, or if she would ever find it. But she knew, with a certainty that calmed her racing heart, that she would never again mistake cleaning for playing, or polish for soul. The real music, she now understood, always came from the cracks. and she was just beginning to learn how to hear it.